Hello, Garland Nixon here, hanging out with my dear friend Regis Tremblay, a guy who actually lives in Crimea. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here, and we're hanging out with Regis Tremblay. Regis is an American. He lives in Crimea. He's done all kinds of great documentary work and movies and all kinds of stuff, and we're really happy to have him. And I think it's important to talk to Regis for this reason. You know, as you all know, I recently was in Russia. I was in Moscow. I went to St. Petersburg. I went to Rzhev, and I went to Minsk in Belarus. And I got my experience, but it was mostly in the big cities. And talking to Regis, you know, I came to the conclusion that, or the realization that if I were to come to the United States and I was going to go to Chicago and New York and DC, yeah, you know, lots of great restaurants and all kinds of things, and I'd get a view of America, but America's a lot more than that, and a lot different in a lot of attitudes and various cultures. And so I want to talk to Regis and get some thoughts and some views, not just for me, but for you also, on other parts of Russia and how people see things in Russia. And, you know, I got to add one other thing. And a lot of us who are, I don't want to use the word pro-Russian, we are in favor of justice. That's it, of justice, of righteousness, and so when we see any war, any conflict, we're on the side of justice. And on this instance, Russia's side is the just side. So, but I think sometimes people get carried away with like everything's perfect in Russia. Everybody gets along fine. Everybody supports the government and everything they do. You know, it's kind of an idealized view. And the U.S. isn't like that, and neither is Russia. Regis, let's get started. Give people your story. You know, you're in Crimea and you moved there, and what you thought maybe of Russia before you got there, and then what you learned maybe when you got there.
Well, thank you for having me, Garland. It's always good to be with you. For your audience who probably doesn't know me or much about me, I'm a filmmaker. I came to Russia for the first time in 2016 because I was trying to finish a film that I entitled 30 Seconds to Midnight. I was deeply concerned at that time of the existential threat, immediate threat of a nuclear war between Russia and the United States. So I had to come to Russia to find out for myself the truth. Were these Russians that bad? Was this government evil? Well, on my first trip, my eyes were opened. I went to Moscow. I thought Moscow was a capitalist city, was one of the most beautiful historic cities that I have ever seen in the entire world. And I've been across Europe. I've been down through Asia. I went to St. Petersburg, very historic, Western-looking kind of city. And I went to Crimea in 2016. That was 2 years after the return of Crimea to Russia. I came home with my eyes opened. Now, I'll be brief. I came back again in 2018 and 2019 with two groups of citizen diplomats, 40 people and 40 Americans in each group, one in 2018, one in 2019. And I documented both of those trips. When I say documented, I made many videos, including a 2-hour session with then was still alive Gorbachev, former president of the Russian Federation. It was an amazing time. I learned a great deal about Russia. I visited some dozen or more cities and villages in small towns. And I returned home and I made a number of videos. But I decided 6 years ago, in March of 2020, it's almost 6 years now, that I wanted to live in Russia, to continue my work, to try to show to primarily American audiences the truth about Russia, because I no longer believed the American narrative, the Russophobia that was prevailing throughout the United States and Europe. And that was not the Russia that I discovered. So, Garland, you and I have known each other for a couple of years now. I was very happy to hear that you visited Russia with Scott Ritter. And at the time, I told you that Moscow was not Russia. And some of the people you met and some of the places you went were indeed parts of Russia. This is an amazing country. Just the landmass is the largest landmass in the world. There are 185 different ethnic groups who speak their own language, but they also speak Russian. They have lived peacefully together for centuries. Religions, the major religions of all kinds, have been respected here. I don't even want to say tolerated. It's not a matter of tolerance. It's a matter of acceptance. Orthodoxy primarily is the most popular religion, but Judaism is here. Asian religion, Buddhists are here. And as are Christians, Roman Catholics, Protestant Christians are here, and they live peacefully together. But what I would like to share with you and your audience tonight are the 6 years that I have lived here now in the Russian Federation, in Yalta, in the Crimea. A view of Russia distinct from the conflict in Ukraine, which is what is all over the American media. You've been covering it with people from Scott Ritter to Andrei Martynov to Glenn Nixon to all of these people. And it's all about the conflict. It's all about the supposed peace negotiations that go on. As an American and as a filmmaker, my focus has really been on who are these Russians? What is this? What is different about Russia? People talk about the Russian soul. And I have tried my best to understand the people here, the Russian people, the people in Crimea, but I've been all over Russia. What is it that makes up their core, their spirit? And this is something that I hope to be able to share with you and your audience tonight. Apart from the conflict that's going on in Ukraine, apart from what NATO and the NATO countries are alleging that Russia wants to invade them and to take over Europe, I hope that you and I tonight can talk about the Russia that I have experienced through my eyes and through the lenses of my cameras.
Sounds good. Great. You know, I remember riding out to Rzhev, and there's this long highway you're on there. And, you know, as always, the weather wasn't great. You know, it was a little snow and ice fitting. It was cold. The entire way we were there, people were working on the highways, right? And it was nasty weather out there. And I looked at those outside and I saw those guys, those men out there with their coats on, working in this cold. And I thought to myself, that's real Russian men right there. You know what I mean? Like, okay, it's great to be in the cities and go to the Bolshoi Ballet and okay, fine. But when you go way out there and you see these guys working on the road with their boots on, you know, 50, 60 miles from Moscow, and they live in these little teeny towns in the area, and you're getting further out. And I think, and I tell you what, my father was a longshoreman. When I see those guys, I think of, you know what I mean? My dad working out in the cold, tough guys who went through hard times. Do you know what I'm saying? So that's where I see a difference. Your thoughts on that and the difference outside of the sea, the things that you're talking about.
Well, the one thing that people in the West, I think, are confused about is that modern day Russia is still somehow the Soviet Union and communist. On my first trip, Garland, and you must have realized this when you went to Moscow, capitalism on steroids is visible everywhere. I was shocked in 2016 when I went to this, you probably visited it, maybe you didn't. Right across from the Kremlin is a huge department store complex, Goop.
Yeah, yeah.
And mind you now, 2016, I went there for the first time, thinking that Moscow, that Russia was backwards, was the Soviet era, and my eyes were opened. I mean, every major brand, European and American brand, was there in that enormous 4 or 5 story department store. And then, as I traveled that first time around, I didn't really have an in-depth view of what Russia was really like. But I came back with the idea and the belief that Russia, since 2000, when President Putin took over, was no longer the Soviet Union, was no longer communist. Garland, the other thing that I have to mention, and we can go much deeper into this, the role of the Orthodox Church in Russia is profound. I have never experienced this kind of devotion anywhere I've been in Europe. And I studied, I should tell your audience this because they don't know. I was a Roman Catholic priest. I was educated in my postgraduate work in Rome, Italy. I traveled all over Europe. I was a priest in the United States for 14 years. I have never seen the devotion that I have witnessed here in Russia. Now, it goes back over 1,000 years. The people here are incredibly devout. I attend a number of different liturgies with my wife, who is a Russian. And I have to tell you, when Americans think that that Russians are communist, that they're atheists, that they're anti-religion, it is the furthest thing from the truth. Even during the Soviet era, when Christianity was supposedly banned, even people like Vladimir Putin was baptized by his grandmother. My in-laws now talk about life during the Soviet era when they too were baptized by their grandparents. Orthodoxy, Christianity has never left this country. Now, Garland, this is just one thing that I would like to share with you and your audience, with Americans especially, that Russia is a very Christian country. They believe in love. They believe in God. There's no doubt about it. They believe in peace and justice and the things that you were talking about. This is part of who the Russians are. I will say this. People can talk about Joseph Stalin, what an evil man he was, and how terrible the Soviet era was. I'm here to tell you tonight, since 2000, when Vladimir Putin took over, Russia has not invaded any other country. People will say, oh, they took over Georgia, they took over Ossetia, they fought terrorism. Russia has not invaded any other country. It is not the Soviet Union. So, Garland, as we continue our discussion tonight, I'm just wondering if you experienced anything I've just talked about with Russia, as you've seen it in the brief time you were here, as something totally different than the Soviet Union, and if you even had any experience of orthodoxy, Russian orthodoxy, on your trip.
Well, a couple of things. One of the things that I will say is that I discovered that in Russia, the culture, here religion is said to be part of the culture, but it is only done so rhetorically. They'll say we're a Christian country. I don't even know what that means anymore. We're a Christian country, but yet we've got to attack countries. We've got to support genocide, war, all kinds of terrible things. So what does a Christian country mean based on what the United States government does, right? But in Russia, the actual belief in what their religion stands for is part of the culture. And it's not, we're an Orthodox country, meaning just rhetorically, it's based on how we act and conduct ourselves as a people. Also, I think I also see that also aligns with a level of patriotism, right? A level of, I'm proud to be Russian. And to be Russian is to love Russia and to be a good Orthodox Christian and to, to support the things that we believe in. So the culture is the religion. And again, there are lots of other, you've got areas that are Muslim. Those are all highly respected. And in the same way, it's you're a Muslim in areas that are kind of autonomous or allowed to kind of conduct themselves based on some of their religious views, right? But all of that goes into, I talk to Muslim people who are very happy to be Russian because they say, well, here we can freely, conduct ourselves. The government has come in and rebuilt mosques that were torn down and different things like that, so that it is part of the culture. And that even adds to part of the patriotism. I'll say this too, interestingly enough. Americans talk about, oftentimes here when they talk about the Soviet Union, and I thought, okay, the Soviet Union and then Russia, right? That like there's a wall. When I went to Russia, I realized there's still a lot of these buildings and these bridges and all these things that were built during the Soviet Union. I noticed something also: very highly educated people. Russians are highly educated. And when I talked to some of the older people, they said, well, that's, again, legacy from the Soviet Union. Everybody got education, blah, 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 like that. So there are still some really strong positive things that are legacy of the Soviet Union. But one of the things out there I really noticed, and I'm sure you could say that, let me put it to you like this. I met a number of Americans who went to Russia for one reason or another, met a Russian woman and didn't leave, right? And, Russian women are very beautiful, absolutely. But when I talked to these people and I met their wives, I understood why. These women, the Russian women, were so highly cultured, highly educated, brilliant, such intellectual and philosophical depth. People think like, oh, this is the issue of a man and woman is highly respected in Russia, but not like a woman is supposed to just stay in a kitchen, bake cookies and not think for herself. I was just, every time I sat down, I'm like, I don't want to talk to you. I want to listen to your wife. She knows every damn thing in the world. Their education, their background, their knowledge of culture and art. And what I'm getting, what I'm saying, don't you?
Well, Garland, you mentioned a number of things that I want to comment on. I'll start with the Russians are incredibly much better educated than we are as Americans. I had an undergraduate degree, liberal arts, in philosophy and United States history. We had studied literature, but it was so superficial. The first time I came here, I met so many Russians who were asking me if I knew about this poet and that poet, and I'm not talking about Hemingway, okay? I'm not talking about Robert Frost. I'm talking about people that basically I had never heard of and studied, and they were quoting these people. I have been challenged on a couple of occasions to interpret, for example, Alice in Wonderland. What were the political overtones of this, the most famous American fairy tale, if you want to call it? I have been embarrassed at how deficient and I thought I had a great education, but how deficient it really was in comparison to what Russians were learning during the Soviet era. Now, I'll tell you this. I have many Russian friends today who say that their educational system has diminished, has gone down. I've met a lot of young Russians, including students. I've spoken to students in the universities. Their education right now, the way I see it, is a lot more intense and rigorous than anything I've ever experienced in the United States. So they are highly educated. And I want to mention this too, Garland. You mentioned Russian women. There are Russian women who are and have been doctors of medicine, of science, in engineering, and space technology going back to the Soviet era. I know some of these people. Some of these people are my friends, and I'm shocked. There's nothing like that in the United States. Women, maybe in the last 15 or 20 years, have been trying to break through the glass ceiling to get to the top echelons of medicine, of law, of science, of technology. This is part and parcel of who these Russian women are. I have a hard time really understanding how that was possible, but it's a fact. The other thing I want to say, I'm looking at a lot of these comments and they're really interesting. Some people are saying some bad things about Joseph Stalin, how evil he was, and how many people, that he killed and he sent to the gulags. But the one thing that the Russians know about the Soviet era, I will say two things. One, under Joseph Stalin, Russia became industrialized. Had it not been for Stalin, Russia would not be the global giant that it is today in terms of industry, in terms of its military, in terms of its industry. Russia is highly, highly proficient in these areas. It all comes from the Soviet era and their education, and that there were no barriers to people, women, men, poor or wealthy, to achieve at the highest levels. This, to me, American people will not believe this. I'm sure many of your audience are saying that this guy, Regis Tremblay, he's really screwed up. He's fucked up. He doesn't know what he's talking about. I'm telling you, after living here now for 6 years and been coming here since 2016, this is what I have discovered about the Russian people. Garland, you mentioned something very briefly about mosques and churches. Garland, in Simferopol, which is about an hour and a half drive by car or by bus from where I live in Yalta, the third largest mosque in all of Russia has been built. I have toured it as a special guest to film this. And this is an amazing, amazing cathedral mosque. It's not a cathedral, it's a mosque. I've never seen anything so large in all my life. But I think you started to mention that, um, I'm not sure, but I will say this. Since the year 2000, the Russian federal government has been restoring not only Orthodox monasteries and churches, rebuilding them, many destroyed during the Bolsheviks, including mosques in Simferopol, in Moscow, and around the country, restoring the religious traditions that had been destroyed during the Soviet era. And so, to put this into context, Garland, what I'm hoping that your audience, and I hope they're not all Russophobes, I hope that there are people, if they listen to you, because I know you are so progressive and so objective, I hope they're understanding what I'm trying to say about the humanity of the Russian people. They are an ancient culture. They're over 1,000 years old. They've been conquered by everybody. The Greeks were the first to come to Crimea 2,000 years before Christ. They've been invaded by the Mongols. They've been invaded by the Swedes, the Finns. They've been invaded by Napoleon. They've been invaded by Hitler. And they have become an incredibly resilient people. And Garland, all I want to say in conclusion to this part of our discussion is that as an American, a patriotic American who loved my country, but who came to not be able to accept what the story we were told about our history, and certainly what the government of the United States has been doing in the last number of years. It doesn't matter who was the president. I came to Russia to try to find out the truth about who these people are. And Garland, I have to tell you, these people are the most loving and forgiving people I have ever met.
Yes, I can attest to that. Something I wanted to ask you about. You live in Crimea, and I'm sure you know people who were there, plenty of people, when it was under Ukraine, and when the 2014 Maidan coup happened, and now. What did the people tell you about, but prior to then and Maidan coup and how they feel about everything? If you could, and I think that's important. I think because, there's a lot of propaganda here about Crimea. Oh, it was stolen from the Ukrainians. The people there, the Tartars, everybody can't wait to get back and goose step around with the Azov battalion. But so let's talk about Crimea, the people that what you've learned about it post Maidan, during the Maidan, pre-Maidan.
Well, I first came here in 2016, 2 years after the Maidan, 2 years after the coup. Now, I have been covering this since before 2014, but certainly with the coup, the involvement of Victoria Nuland, Jeffrey Pyatt, Joseph Biden, he was basically in charge. He was the vice president at the time. I've been covering it ever since then. And as I mentioned, part of the reason for coming here in 2016 was to find the truth about Russia and who they were, what happened in Crimea. Now, I've been living here for 6 years. I have been involved on many levels here in the past 6 years. I have friends who are in the government here in Crimea, as well as Moscow. I have become a respected person with the academics here in the universities in Simferopol and Sevastopol. I'm included in conferences and forums on a number of different political issues, most of them having something to do with America. I have made many friends, and including in the journalist community, I was made a member of the Sevastopol Journalist Association, which is the largest here in Crimea. Many of these people are now my friends. When I came here the first time, my friends in the United States said, when you go there, we're giving you a list of questions we want you to ask. Now, there were many questions about Putin. There were many questions about LGBTQ. There were many questions about Crimea and that Putin came in here with the military and took it back. I have interviewed dozens of people who were involved in resisting the coup that took place in Kiev in 2014. Journalists, people in the government, and what the people in the United States have a hard time dealing with. 87% of the people in Crimea turned out for the election. 98% of those people voted in the referendum to return to Russia. I can tell you right now, that is the absolute truth of what happened here. I have been now living here for 6 years. What I saw in 2016 is not what I saw 6 years ago when I came here. Highways have been, Garland, the first time I drove from the airport in Simferopol to Yalta, the highway had potholes in it. I mean, you'd have a hard time avoiding these things. All of these roads now have been paved over and completed. Crimea had been neglected by Ukraine in those 50 years that it was administered by Ukraine. Trash was everywhere. Infrastructure had been just rotted out and run down. And now, in these years, the Russian Federation has invested billions and billions of dollars, rubles, but the equivalent in dollars, in rebuilding infrastructure, incredible new highways crisscrossing Crimea, new hospitals, new schools. Garland, I fell 5 years ago at night and broke my hip. I was brought to the local hospital. The care that I received was as good as anything I've received in the United, and I've had 2 knee replacements in the United States. I had a hip replacement in the hospital here in Yalta, and the operatory and the physicians were as good as any I experienced in America. All because of the money that the Russian Federation had invested here in Crimea. I still talk to, I live amongst them. They're my in-laws. They're my friends. And I say to them, do you think life is so much better now under the Russian Federation than Ukraine? And it's like, they're saying, why are you still asking this question? I'm serious. I have lived here now 6 years. Garland, what I have now is free medical care. I never had that in the United States. I have permanent residency now. I'm hoping someday to get a passport. I will not reject my American citizenship ever, but I have free medical care. Public transportation is everywhere. It's efficient. It's on time. Everything here is clean. Everything here is, Garland, maybe some of your listeners are still believing that our shelves in the grocery stores are empty, that we're starving. You have to know, when you visited Russia late last year, that the grocery stores are packed with everything. The department stores have everything that you could possibly want or need, even above your basic essentials. There's nothing here in Yalta, in Crimea, that I might want or need that I cannot find. And Garland, much cheaper than what I would be paying in the United States. I'll finish on this one note and then let you pick it up again. the cost of living here for many Russians that are doing well, that have good jobs, they're doing fine. There are many people here who do not have maybe good jobs, especially those who are elderly and retired. Their pensions are not high. Nothing like I'm living on Social Security. I'm living on a small pension, 2 stints in government in Arizona and in Maine, and I can live here frugally. But I lack nothing. I'm living comfortably. I don't have a car. I decided when I left I would not come because I did my due diligence on figuring out how it would be if I moved to Russia, if I made to move to Crimea or Yalta. And I can tell you and your audience, the standard of living here in Russia is extremely good. I could not live, Garland, on what I earn every month in the United States. And I was living in the state of Maine. Without a car, you are landlocked. It's a rural state. And I had a wonderful Subaru hatchback that rusted out because of the ice and because of the salt in the winter. And my mechanic said, you know, I can't certify your car anymore. And to get a new car, I would have had to have another $2,000 or $3,000 to get another old one. And I couldn't afford it. And here in Russia, I have no need of a vehicle. In fact, a vehicle anywhere here in where I live in Yalta is an impediment. There's no freaking place to park it. The hills here, it's like a mini San Francisco. There's no place to park. And so public transportation is very effective. It's very efficient. It costs me less than 50 cents to take a bus from one side of Yalta to the other. So what I'm trying to convey to you and to your audience is that Russia is not just Moscow, St. Petersburg. It's not just Stalingrad. Russia is an amazing country that, in spite of all of the sanctions, in spite of all the, I have to call it evil propaganda and lies about Russia and the Russian Federation, about President Putin, none of it is true. And I'll finish this part with this. When I came here the first time, and when I decided to live here, my mission as a filmmaker, as a I'm a podcaster, just like you are, has been to try to show to primarily American people the truth that I have found through my eyes, my lived experience here. And it is not what they are led to believe about Russia and the Russian people. If only people in the United States could realize that Russia is a peaceful country, is a Christian, primarily Christian country where other religions are respected. But Russia is not the evil empire that it is being portrayed to be. If I can, with the days that I have left in my life, can make a small difference into educating people about who the Russians are and what the Russian state is really about, I will be happy and feel fulfilled.
You know, another thing that's interesting, because I had people say to me, and you know, this is, of course, a very American thing to say. And I told people, nobody had ever said anything like this in Russia. Very American. They said, well, but what was it like? You know, you're in Moscow and you're a Black person, and there's not a lot of Black people. And my answer was, I really didn't notice. And I don't think anybody else did either. You know, when you're in the streets of Moscow, it's very safe in Russia. And I'll say this about Russians: they tend to mind their own business. You know what I mean? I mean, when you see Russians out on the street doing their things, they tend to be focused on what they're doing. They don't tend to be all into what's this guy will do. You know what I mean? And, you know, I went to different restaurants. I remember one restaurant I was in, and there was a bunch of people at a table, like 12 or 15 people. I guess they're having some kind of family thing. They looked like they were Chinese. They were extremely Asian features. And they were all speaking Russian. And I talked to people and they said, oh, yeah, well, you know, we've got areas of the, you know, and I came to come to find out you have people from areas of Russian that are Siberian that look kind of like indigenous people that are near the Chinese, or that they have a border with North Korea. You had people that you look at that, genetically speaking, are probably more Korean than or Chinese, you know, from the perspective of the way we would say it. They're just Russians and they're speaking Russians, and some of them have indigenous or local tongues. And I came to realize something that, you know, having studied Paul Robeson and find out about his history in Russia and what he discovered when he went to Russia, was that is an American question. That ain't even a Russian in question. He's black, he's this, he's that. That's not a conversation that would even make sense to Russians.
You mentioned a couple of things. You being a Black American, a person of color, I would have to agree. There's not a great deal of Black American people here in Russia. There are people from Africa,
yes,
more and more all the time, because Russia is focusing a lot of its diplomatic and economic and political influence in Africa, in the global South. But you do not see the prejudice here in Russia that exists, the racism that in Russia that you see in the West, especially in the United States. Because, as you mentioned, the further east you go, these people are more Asian looking. They're more, I have to tell you, they look like Chinese, they look like North Koreans, they look like Japanese, depending on what part of Eastern Russia you're talking about. And so Russia has been a very tolerant country in terms of race. I've never seen an indication of racism here in this country like I have witnessed in my own country, the United States. You mentioned something else just in passing. Russia is a very safe country. I was shocked on my first visit in 2016 in Moscow, where I was there for like almost 2 weeks. And I didn't know who these people were, but they were all communists, members of the Communist Party. Now imagine an American coming here and being hosted by 5 members of the Communist Party in Moscow. They took care of me. They gave me housing in an apartment that basically turned out to be their Communist Party headquarters. They took me all over. They showed me Moscow. They took me to the Bolshoi Theater. They took me to see the museums and the monuments. And I was shocked to discover that they were just like you and me. And I was out late at night, as they all are, 10, 11 o'clock, midnight. Young girls, elderly women by themselves, walking the streets of Moscow, taking the metro. And when you think of metro, people in the United States they think of like New York City, or they think of Chicago or whatever. Oh my God, these places are dirty, they're filthy. Everything here is immaculate. The Moscow metro, begun during the Soviet era, is full of artwork, is full of sculpture, it's the most beautiful place underground I've ever seen. And so when you talk about being safe, I'm living here in Crimea. there's almost no crime. I don't hear of any crime. Yeah, there's a few drunks that you're going to find everywhere, but they don't pose a problem. But young girls, Garland, I had 3 kids. When my kids were small and growing up, and we lived in Arizona, if we went into a mall, we would not let go of the hands of any one of my kids. You'd be terrified. If your kid, all of a sudden, you couldn't find them, you got desperately worried about it. Garland, the thing I still can't believe here, parents have no concern when a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old on a little scooter, okay? I don't know what else to call it. They have these little 2-wheel scooters. Right. Everybody has them. The kids are going up and you go, where's the mama? Where's the papa? And they're going in and out of malls. They're going in and out of these huge streets, encampments along the sea. Nobody's concerned that anything's going to happen to their kids. Nobody is concerned about being not safe. And Garland, I said in the first film that I made when I went back in 2016, it was called Je suis Russia. I said, I've never felt safer in Russia than I have in the United States. And all of my friends told me before I left to go on this first trip, be careful over there.
I've heard the same thing. Well, it's safe in Russia. I'm like, safe in Russia? It's not safe here. I'm scared to go to East Baltimore. I'd go to Moscow all day long. What was interesting, it's funny you said that, because I had some friends say, we're going to go to the volunteers. The volunteers want to meet you. And I'm like, how do they know who I am? But okay. And I was shocked how many people knew who I was. And I think a lot of them saw videos with me and Scott. So at any rate, so one evening, we're going to meet the volunteers. I wasn't sure what that was, but we went to this area, and there was a big industrial plaza area, and there was a little small area there, not small, pretty good area. These people were volunteers, and they were putting together care packages to go to the front. They were volunteering. They were putting together all kinds of stuff. Yeah. I come to find out they do that all over. The government doesn't ask them to do it.
No, it's everywhere.
So they were in there, literally. I saw this big wide thing of gauze. I've never seen a roll of gauze that big in my life. I didn't think one existed. And there was a woman, and she had patterns. She was cutting out the patterns. I asked them, what are they doing? They said, oh, they're making first aid kits for the soldiers, right? And I said, wow, how much gauze is that? And they said, oh, it's about 3.5 kilometers. I'm like, what? They said, we go through about one a week. And they're making all of these things. They gave me this. I know you'll be familiar with this.
Oh, yeah.
Cheparashka or something like that. And I said, what is that? And they said the soldiers put them in their tanks and their BMPs and all that. That it's like all of it was a big, very famous cartoon for
it still is.
And that the kids, they love it. So that they had those and all that. And so I went in and I saw this big picture of Stalin. I said, oh, and so they said, here's a hat. It was a red hat. Put that over. We're going to take a picture. I took a picture with the red hat. I said, by the way, what do those things mean across the front? They said, oh, that means Communist Party of the Russian Federation. Right?
SSR, CCCP. Yeah.
So they gave me a CCCP hat. But at any rate, and listen to this. They had a picture of President Putin. They had a picture of Scott Ritter that was signed in there, and a picture of Stalin. That's what they had. A big picture of Stalin, a big picture of Scott Ritter, and a big picture of President Putin. But they were so wonderful. They knew who I was. Oh, yeah, we saw you on YouTube, Rutu, whatever it is. And they had, oh, you've got to have food. And, oh, they were hugging me. It was like women and elderly people. And they were working. They were filling this truck up with stuff to go. Oh, that's going to go to Donetsk. And then it's going to get distributed to the soldiers and blah, blah. Some people had literally driven to the front in their own cars. And I'm like, oh, my gosh, isn't that dangerous? Oh, yes, we saw drones flying over. Ukrainian soldiers looked at us. We just sped up. I'm like, for God's sake, you people are risking your. Anyway, my point being, the people there are so dedicated. It was incredible. But we're just about out of time. I want to get a final some final thoughts from you.
Yeah, I do want to mention something about, we've not talked about the war in Ukraine. I'm glad you mentioned the volunteers across Russia, including right here in Crimea, who have been volunteering to provide everything from food, medicine, uh, emergency care things, whatever. I want your audience to understand this. For over 50 years, people in Crimea and the Ukraine were one. They were one country, the Soviet Union. They intermarried. My wife's family, okay, the grandmother, my mother-in-law, was born in Poltava in Ukraine. All of these Russians have mixed marriages. They have relatives in Ukraine. My wife went to the university in Kiev to finish her schooling. And what is so terrible about this is that there is this animosity and hatred that still exists between, especially the people in Ukraine, who continue to blame Russia and blame people here in Crimea for leaving Ukraine. It has strained families. It really is a humanitarian crisis, a catastrophe. It's extremely heartbreaking when you meet people who have mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, cousins, and classmates on either side who are torn and driven apart because of this conflict. I can only hope that it somehow ends as soon as possible. I do not think that Donald Trump has been sincere in wanting to achieve peace. He's wanting to make economic deals with Witkoff and Kushner coming here. They're not talking about peace. They're talking about business. They're trying to tempt the Russians. And Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, said it best. There's a two-track process that's going on. The track of Witkoff and Kushner, who are trying to tempt Russia with economic deals. And then there's the diplomatic side where nothing is happening. And Lavrov has said there is no peace deal that's going to happen between Russia and the United States because the United States is not trustworthy and the United States is agreement incapable. That's where we are today, and it's unfortunate.
Yes, yes. I was glad to hear what he said. They've been avoiding saying it. I understand what the Russians are doing. They're very good diplomats, and they've been playing the diplomatic game. And I understand, and they're smart people. And all along I said, no, they're not stupid. I don't underestimate them. But I just knew they would go. And the other interesting thing he said, look, while they're to sum it up, while they're smiling in our faces, they're doing everything they can to contact people to try to get them to stop buying Russian oil. They're going around the world trying to stab us in the back. Now, this is my paraphrase, but they're going around the world economically trying to stab us in the back while they're trying to pretend like they want to do us a favor and work with us, and basically, we know what you're doing and we'll talk to you, fair enough, but let's not let anybody be misled into thinking that we don't know exactly who you are and what you're doing. And, it is what it is. Well, thank you very much. And I think, let's face it, the whole Epstein thing coming out, I mean, at some point, we people like us who are the crazy conspiracy theorists, we already knew who they were. But now everybody's finding out what we've been trying to tell people for years. Thank you very much, Regis. And I need to get you back on soon. We got a lot, as you know, this was just like the opening salvo for our talk. We got a lot of things that we need to discuss about Russia, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, Garland. It's been a pleasure being with you again.
All right, thank you. And this is also playing simultaneously on Regis's channel. What is your channel, Regis?
Alfredo Baldic on YouTube, and Trem Reggie on Facebook and X and other places.
All right, thanks a lot, everybody. So you can find all of his and Regis does a lot of really good interviews with a lot of people in Russia and other places. Thanks a lot, Regis. Look forward to talking to you again soon. Everyone, make sure you share this on all your social media platforms. We're out.